to express my thanks for this kind invitation, and it's a great pleasure and honor to be part of this occasion and this whole series of celebrations. As I've been requested to join this seminar on the pleasure of teaching Shakespeare, I decided to talk about my own journey, how I discovered my research topic in the past couple of years, which includes a lot of, or it has been supported by a lot of input from students, from my teaching work, and also, so I always feel that teaching and research are supporting each other, and they can give us, and hopefully through our enjoyment to our teachers or to our students and colleagues as well, a lot of pleasure in discovering Shakespeare. So I will try to share my screen, and let's hope that it will work. And I hope that you can see my screen, the first slide, and let me know if
yes, ma'am, we can see.
Okay. So I chose for this title, The Pleasures of Discovery, Finding Shakespeare in Genre Films, because as I'm going to tell you and show you in the next couple of minutes, it was not where I started my research. I started with a very traditional Shakespeare studies research, and finding Shakespeare in films which were originally not my research area gave, I think, students and also myself a lot of pleasure. So, and I hope that slides have moved, and just a final check. So
yes, ma'am.
Good, brilliant, thank you. So just to sum up briefly where I started and how I ended up doing what I am doing in the past couple of years, I really have to go back to what has already been said in this kind of introduction. My studies were very traditional philological studies. I graduated at Budapest Ötvös University's PhD program with a traditional close reading of texts, maybe some of the most famous Shakespearean tragedies, Hamlet and King Lear. And at the time, for me, film adaptations gave, of course, a lot of pleasure, as to all of us, I suppose, but they were no more than a hobby. And at one point, I started combining these two, and also thinking about these film adaptations of Shakespearean drama, trying to find what exactly are we watching. I know that some students, actually some of these questions came from my students who wanted to skip reading. It was not at university, but earlier when I was teaching at a primary and secondary school. They wanted to ask me sometimes that if they don't want to read the book, can they watch a film instead? Is it the same thing? And of course, I try to tell them that why it's not the same thing, even though it might be interesting and enjoyable to watch a film based on a literary text. So I started to think about it in a more systematic way. What are we watching really when we are watching a film? And when we are trying to find Shakespeare in a film adaptation, what are we looking for? Because very often we feel disappointment. Very often we feel that this is not like in the book, in the play, on the stage. This is not how I imagined it. So what are we supposed to find there? Are we looking for the plot? Very often the plots are not Shakespearean, definitely not Shakespearean inventions. So why do we say that the storyline is what Shakespeare gave us when there is so much more? Is it the text? That very often comes up in discussions, that Shakespeare's language, Shakespeare's text is what gives the Shakespearean flavor to any adaptation as well. But of course, all of us who have watched films in languages other than in English, and also sometimes in English in versions that are not the Shakespearean original, we know that very often, even without the Elizabethan or Jacobean language, we can find Shakespearean elements. Sometimes it's no more than a general atmosphere. Sometimes we feel that the message, if there is something that we can define as the message of a play, the main themes, the main motives are there without an original plot. And of course, we also know that when we talk about Shakespeare, words like original should be used very carefully, since we don't have the original manuscripts and we have a lot of indirect information about him. So when we look at film adaptations, we distinguish, and we have to distinguish between two kinds of films, which are the two basic categories: filmmaking, the auteur films, which express a director's, a filmmaker's own artistic style. We often refer to these films as a Zeffirelli film, a Tarantino film, Polanski film, or many other great names, rather than the famous actors, for instance. And then there are, of course, the genre films, which are often referred to as the commercial, mass-produced, popular cultural products, which are defined by their generic features. We know that if we choose to watch a romantic comedy, we can expect a certain plot line, certain characters will be joined in happy relationships or even matrimony. If we are watching a crime story, then we can expect a crime to happen towards the beginning and then to be solved by the end. How do these features, an auteur's own signatures and the genre's features, sometimes how can they be combined with a literary author's own work? So what I wanted to find is a kind of a flexible approach that can combine all of these elements and that can appreciate all of these elements for what they are, rather than missing something that doesn't even want to be there. So I also believe that the most successful approach is when we approach genre films from their genres or films from their original context. And we have to look at these adaptations as adaptations. And if it's a genre film, it has to be seen as a genre film. So if at the end of a Hamlet adaptation, the Hamlet character doesn't die, it's not necessarily a bad Hamlet adaptation. It might be, for instance, a Western film, which has been made actually, such a film in the 1960s. And of course, a cowboy doesn't die. A cowboy ends the film by riding off into the sunset. This is a cliche of the genre. And if we use this cliche, we are following a genre's stereotypes and rules. And of course, we have to fit the literary inspiration into this framework. So in this way, by accepting this necessarily flexible approach, I think we can discover the pleasure of finding many new versions of Shakespeare, which are not equivalent in any sense to the dramatic or the literary, the performed variants, but can add to this knowledge that Shakespeare lives and thrives in all variations all over the globe. So in the next couple of minutes, I would like to show you several variations and mostly variations of the same drama and how they appear in different genres or different types of films, to show you what I mean by a flexible approach that is needed. So first of all, and just one brief example of the book cover that combines, or that's published the summary of my my research for the past couple of years. This is the cover of my book, and a brief look at the contents in this book that came out 2 years ago at Manchester University Press. I looked at classical Hollywood genres and contemporary blockbuster genres, so from the Western through melodrama to gangster and film noir films, and then teen films and zombie and vampire films with biopics, so biographical features. I chose these 6 genre groups to maybe help my readers catch a glimpse at this huge variety of products. So if we look at variations of Romeo and Juliet, we can look at, this is not the earliest film, but one of the great Hollywood classics of the 1930s. George Cukor, or Cukor, as his name is often pronounced, was a great Hollywood director who descended actually from a family of Hungarian origins. If you look at this film today, my students often say that it's a boring, old, slow film. But of course, we can look at it as a perfect representation of that great period of Hollywood studio filmmaking, when Shakespeare was used as an authenticating force. Cinema was still a new genre, or a new medium, relatively. Therefore, they used these most highly appreciated literary sources to show that the cinema is not just a popular form of entertainment, but also capable of showing the greatest masters of culture. A couple of decades later, a very different type of Romeo and Juliet was made by Franco Zeffirelli. Again, it's interesting that to my students today, Zeffirelli's 1968 film seems an old-fashioned, very classical, traditional, conservative film. At the time, it was revolutionary, mostly because no one has ever cast such young actors in the main roles of Romeo and Juliet, even though Shakespeare explicitly mentions Juliet's age, as she is 14, and also Romeo is a young man. But this was not the tradition. So even these traditional auteur films express something of the age and the cultural context of their production. And then, of course, probably many of you know a more recent adaptation by Baz Luhrmann. Again, we can find many genre features, from the gangster film to many other elements, but this is still very much a film that fits into this great Australian filmmaker's, Baz Luhrmann's oeuvre. And we can also connect it to many other films that he's made, from Moulin Rouge to many others. And of course, we can find Romeo and Juliet in animated versions. One of my particular favorites is Romeo and Juliet, made a bit over 10 years ago, which, again, if looked from or superficially, we might just find it a childish version. But actually, if you look at it carefully, it's full of references to Shakespeare that the more you know about Shakespeare's life and work, the more you appreciate the very intelligent type of humor that was used or that went into making this film. And also there is a zombie film recently, very popular, Warm Bodies, with very popular contemporary young actors, Nicholas Hoult and Theresa Palmer. Again, I don't want to spoil the ending for those of you who haven't seen it yet. Again, because of the genre, this plot line of or a story of doomed lovers doesn't exactly end as we would expect from Shakespeare's version. Of course, many of these films show us how certain iconic scenes can be varied, but actually certain iconic scenes already stand for the play themselves. So if we see an image of a balcony, and especially if we see a girl standing on the balcony and the boy standing below the balcony in the garden, then we will immediately recognize the play. Such is the power of Shakespeare's well-written and well-designed scenes. Of course, if you look at various balconies, we can see that all of these or none of these are Shakespeare's balcony. This is the one in Verona, which is shown to tourists, but of course, this doesn't really have anything to do with Shakespeare himself. He never saw it. It was built later. It's not a real thing. And yet it works to fire up our imagination. This was the balcony used in George Cukor's films. This is Zeffirelli's balcony. And actually it made the young actress, Olivia Hussey, so famous that she was later in a biography described as the girl on the balcony. So she was so much identified with this film and her most famous first role. But of course, we have even very unusual variations in Mickey Mouse and in Lego short videos. It's enough to show such a scene, and we are immediately identifying these new variations with Shakespeare. And of course, this gives us a pleasure of discovery. And also some of these pleasures come from accidental discoveries. So very often we don't necessarily watch genre films or popular films with an eye to research, but very often we find something that we can connect back to what we have been working on. Another variation or another play with many variations, for instance, King Lear, another tragedy, which has inspired first a novel and then a film adaptation, 1,000 Acres, which we can describe as a melodrama, a contemporary melodrama, but it's also very much a story of the American Midwest with great American actors. Another film, Christian Levring's The King is Alive, fits very much into the Danish dogme tradition. It's a very different style of filmmaking, much more fragmented, much more independent from the Hollywood features or Hollywood traditions of filmmaking. And this can also bring and draw our attention to elements of the play that we never thought so important. A British gangster film, My Kingdom, directed by Don Boyd. Also, most of these films are made around the turn of the millennium. Again, shows us how much we can look at this story as a very cruel story of people hurting others rather than sharing humanity. Another film from around the same time goes back to the Western traditions, with Patrick Stewart in a role of a King Lear-like character in a made-for-television movie called King of Texas. Another comic variation, which is also a so-called mirror movie, when a film is about actors. So actors are playing actors who are putting together a show of King Lear. And this is British comedy, a bunch of amateurs. It's about a small village troupe who are trying to save their village stage, but they're all amateurs. And then they invite a great Hollywood star who is more or less a has-been already, played by Burt Reynolds. And together they try to stage Shakespeare. And it's a very interesting but very comic journey of discovery. There's another film, and I suppose that this actress might be a lot more familiar to many of you now. Life Goes On is set in London, but it uses very much of the Bollywood or Indian filmmaking traditions. It's about the diaspora, Indian diaspora, a family living in London in the 21st century. And at a first glimpse, it would be interesting to see that a King Lear adaptation has a mother figure at its center. But of course, this is also explained by the tradition of a melodramatic film tradition, which is the framework for this film. And that explains why the mother figure, who is absent from Shakespeare's tragedy, takes such a prominent role in this film. It's a beautiful film, by the way. Just briefly, a few more variations. For instance, Othello, another tragedy, has been reworked also by George Cukor, previously mentioned Hollywood filmmaker, as a double life. This is a film noir and also a so-called mirror movie, just like Stage Beauty on the other side. And actually these comparisons also often help me find the genre features of films. And these are very interesting discoveries with students as well. When we look at two films, in this case, for instance, Double Life and Stage Beauty, both of which are about stage actors performing Othello, but you couldn't imagine more different films. A Double Life as a film noir, a dark vision of a male ego struggling with all sorts of psychological issues, as a lot of film noir do, as opposed to Stage Beauty, which is practically a romantic comedy, but it's also a historical film set in the Restoration period, looking at how this change from only actors, male actors allowed on stage, had to give way because of the change of times to female actresses also playing female roles. And in the middle of that, there is, of course, a lot of discovery of identities, but also a lot of interesting pleasures seeing how this film and the filmmakers, the famous director Richard Eyre, is also playing with Shakespeare, what Shakespeare represents, how Shakespeare can appear on stage. And in the center, the middle poster is a teen film, which is actually not a teen comedy, which is a more typical genre, but a teen tragedy. In this, Othello is set in an American high school, and instead of the battlefield, instead of the wars, we are watching wars on the sports, in the sports arena, a basketball film. But this film is also very much realistically picturing all sorts of tensions in young American society. And then again, 3 variations of the Taming of the Shrew, the same play inspired a classic 1950s musical, Kiss Me Kate, but also Zeffirelli's Taming of the Shrew from the 1960s, and a more recent Hollywood comedy, 10 Things I Hate About You, which was not even advertised as a Shakespeare film at the time of its release, because, of course, probably filmmakers were afraid that students might not be so happy to go to the cinema if they thought that, well, they have to watch a Shakespeare film. But because the film was so successful, later on, they admitted that, of course, it was inspired by Shakespeare. And this was all that I have come to show you today. Thank you very much for your attention. And I hope that based on some of these examples, you will continue to discover various pleasures in reading and watching Shakespeare and films, and combining your hobbies with your research, because I think that's where great discoveries are waiting for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, ma'am, for your insightful theme address. May I now request today's second theme speaker, Professor Liam Semler, sir, Professor of Early Modern Literature, Discipline of English, the University of Sydney, Australia, to enlighten us on the topic, Projecting Shakespeare, Shakespeare Reloaded, and Edge of the Chaos. For the next 25 to 30 minutes, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much. It's a thrill to be here, and I really am delighted to be part of this event. So thank you very much for having me. And today, I'll share my screen now. My talk will be based on the forthcoming book that I've co-edited. And that book is Reimagining Shakespeare Education, Teaching and Learning Through Collaboration. And I'll be arguing, I think, that the pleasure of teaching and learning Shakespeare can be released in the context of collaborative project work, where we work with other people to produce new projects to think about Shakespeare outside our usual run of institutional teaching and learning. And you can see here, this book, it'll be published in February, and it has 21 chapters which detail different Shakespeare projects from around the world, and has a look at their educational side. So how education is expressed in different collaborative projects. And it's co-edited with my colleagues Claire Hanson from the Australian National University and Jacqueline Manuel from the university I'm at, the University of Sydney. And the three of us are part of a collaborative project called Better Strangers, which runs the Shakespeare Reloaded website, which I'll get to at the end. But as a tiny bit of background to contextualize things, I'll say just a tiny bit about the structure of this book. It has 5 parts, and the first part has authors writing about projects that reimagine Shakespeare education in schools. And so, for example, the Australian Bell Shakespeare Company, they talk about how they teach Shakespeare in primary or elementary school level and ways to approach teaching young kids about Shakespeare. But that section also includes a chapter from, for example, the Shakespeare Schools Festival in the UK, which is a very large and inclusive festival that invites schools all around the UK to perform parts of Shakespearean plays, and it gives students a wonderful experience with the plays. That's just a couple of examples from part 1. In part 2, I've got authors contributing there about writing about how Shakespeare relates to universities. And so, for example, one of the chapters is about Radical Mischief, which is a collaborative project between the University of Birmingham's Shakespeare Institute and the Royal Shakespeare Company and their theatre, The Other Place. And in that chapter, they talk about trying to break down the boundary between academic scholarship and theatrical practice, and various other ways to cross boundaries. Another example in that university section is a wonderful project that actually has students doing a Shakespeare course in one American state, and their work that they write gets looked at by prisoners who are studying Shakespeare in prison in another state, and the prisoners comment on the work of the students. And so this wonderful insights going back and forth between different cohorts of learners. In part 3, public reimaginings, a couple of examples from that section of the book. Hecate is one of the most wonderful. That is a modern adaptation of Macbeth into an Aboriginal Australian language. And so the language is Noongar, and it's the first time that a Shakespearean play has been fully translated. The point about that is that it is also helping preserve the language, which is endangered, and it's helping teach that Aboriginal language at the same time as it's showcasing Shakespeare, but also speaking back against Shakespeare. Another of the public chapters in the book is about the pop-up globe, which was a New Zealand innovation, a scaffold-built version of the second Globe Theatre, which put on very lively performances for a number of years and was a highly successful pop-up theatrical event. In part 4 of the book, digital reimaginings, one of the key things that's addressed in that part is the way scholars are now trying to link up different digital resources. So there's very much a focus on thinking, well, if a student was looking at one line in a play, could they very easily look at, say, paintings and portraits relating to that one line, at the same time as they might look at different versions of that one line in original texts, and maybe even look at scholarship addressing that single line. So that's about linking up resources. In addition to that, we've got a chapter in there from Gina Bloom about her Play the Knave game, which is a motion capture game that has students acting out scenes and watching their avatars perform scenes. So there's a variety of digital reimaginings of Shakespeare. And finally, in part 5, we have a range of people involved in collaborative projects relating to theatrical performance. One of the most amazing is Flute Theatre, which takes Shakespearean plays and makes them workable and engaging for audiences where families have autistic children. And so it turns the plays into games that the children can play, and it's a wonderful initiative, Flute Theatre. And there are various other examples in the performance section of the book. So that gives you kind of a sense of the way the book is trying to explore different ways that people collaborate to present Shakespeare and to think about what education might mean in those contexts. I'll now read a little bit from the introduction of the book. And so this is co-authored work between me and Claire Hansen and Jacqueline Manuel. And then I'll finish up by pointing a little bit to our project, Shakespeare Reloaded. So this is how the book begins. Shakespeare education is nothing if not paradoxical. Shakespeare education is a legacy beast. It's inherently authoritative and socially entrenched. And Shakespeare education stalks young people from the cover of the past. It's bound up with the history of 18th to 20th century Western education, inside and outside the classroom. And it has strong ties to empire, to institutions, associations, popular culture, and social movements and norms. Educational uptake is always, over the centuries, interconnected with the ebb and flow of Shakespeare spoken and performed on stages and on film, and Shakespeare edited and interpreted on pages and on web pages. There are myriad local conditions within the United Kingdom or the Anglophone world or the world at large that powerfully reconfigure Shakespeare. And yet, despite the differences around the world, Shakespeare education in many regions carries with it the claim of shared human values and high art. And these claims are widely, not universally, accepted, and yet they are deeply problematic. The global brand power of Shakespeare is so extraordinary that even plays with decidedly upsetting content in a 21st century context, such as Titus Andronicus, The Taming of the Shrew, Othello, The Merchant of Venice, these plays maintain their popularity on stage and their position on school curricula. And that positioning on curricula is made more complex by the fact that they are now doing important social justice work, these texts and others in the canon, that they're facilitating social justice work within the classroom. Now, if we think of education itself as land, then Shakespeare has a sizable property portfolio, and his estates endure through generations, and he has enormous incumbent power, and that power shapes the present of education and the future of education, because millions of young people are brought up on Shakespeare's estates, and consequently millions of young people are beneficiaries of his largesse, which is a creative and intellectual gift that is extraordinary and inspiring. But it does have powerful strings attached in the form of habits of thought, racialized poetics, and cultural norms. So no wonder then that Shakespeare and the texts bearing his name echo through discussions of anti-racist reading and pedagogy, socially just teaching, and the decolonization of curricula. Because when there is only so much land in an educational context, and those who have much need to relinquish and renegotiate their holdings if those who have little or none are to find their place in schools and universities and thus gain appropriate representation in public imaginaries and social policy. The degree to which the institutional past of westernized Shakespeare education, in other words, its old industrial processes of education and its imperial values, the degree to which those own and curtail the future of Shakespeare education is up to us, because this is a question of what is imaginable by the living. And so for all his establishment power, Shakespeare education is actually being reimagined all the time by everyone, everywhere. And such reimagining of Shakespeare education may be on a large scale or a small scale. It might be radical or conservative. It might be driven by individuals or groups, or conducted in theory or practice, or worked out in relation to countless other factors. Now, we could valuably take an insight from Ewan Fernie. Today, it is more important than ever to learn from Shakespeare that we're free. We could take that insight and we could sink it into the soil of Shakespeare education and see what emerges in response. Fernie's words are profound, and they become more so when we interweave them with a query. And what if we are not free in society, in institutions, in the classroom? This is not to critique Fernie, but actually to digest his insight slowly in order to feel what this learning and what this freedom might be. Because the reimagining of Shakespeare education entails the reimagining of both Shakespeare and education. Because when Shakespeare researchers discover new things about Shakespeare, they contribute to different approaches in teaching. And when educational methods more generally change across the world, then that changes the way we present Shakespeare and the way we think about what we're teaching when we teach Shakespeare. Old styles of teaching and learning, which have a strong emphasis on the old regulation of students into quite highly defined places and ways of thinking, those older styles are being modified by many changes that are going through the educational sector nowadays, where schools are being built differently and more open plan. Educational processes are being rethought and philosophical values are changing. Digitization was already changing education before the pandemic. And collaborative education, creative expression, and place-based and outdoor education, and problem or inquiry-based learning, all of these are rising as new norms. And there's a strong tradition of books, practical books on teaching Shakespeare that's rising. Academic journals are dedicated in various ways to special issues on the teaching of Shakespeare. The British Shakespeare Association's magazine, Teaching Shakespeare, has reached its 20th issue in 2021. And in that year, Cambridge University Press also launched its Elements series in Shakespeare and Pedagogy. Furthermore, the Race Before Race Professional Network Community and Conference Series, Critical Race Theory and Pre-Modern Critical Race Studies and related scholarship and pedagogy from the late 20th century through to the present are having an enduring impact on not only what is imaginable in Shakespeare education, but also on what freedom might look like when reading, researching, performing, or teaching Shakespeare's works. Now, all of that is an extraordinary narrative of pedagogical rejuvenation, but it's interestingly blended with the persistence of old-style schooling practices and entrenched socio-cultural and educational inequities worldwide, and also penetrating critiques of technology and software and data use in education. And the result of all this is that we're left with some profound questions. Why do we teach Shakespeare? What is Shakespeare? How should we teach Shakespeare? To whom should we teach Shakespeare? What does it mean to teach, or to learn, or to perform, or to experience? Even, what is education? Now, people everywhere are not lacking in imagination. All adults, all children, all teachers and students are gifted with beautiful powers of imagining. But the prerequisite to imagining our way to exciting futures is an ability to imagine our way out of present constraints. And those constraints are often complex and not always visible. And so seeing futures often depends on actively seeing the present. And that means seeing the present as a weave of historical and ideological structures and feeling able to critique it, but without, one hopes, oversimplifying it or discarding extraordinary artistic or social constructs in the process. And to see the present clearly, we need to hear the voices of the marginalized, because they see it much more vividly than those at the center. And it's also important to achieve that sort of vision that we hear and understand students and their worlds, rather than simply imposing year after year the same old formula onto teaching and learning as if the world never changes. And that's not easy, because in most schools and universities, career educators age as the years pass, while incoming cohorts of students do not. And when many of us started teaching, and here I speak just for myself, we were mistaken for students because we were young. But now, decades later, we get mistaken for dinosaurs. And that's fine, so long as we embrace the present with empathy, intellectual interest, and pedagogies of care. Because if we don't embrace the present with these things, then the only thing holding teachers and students together will be institutional structures. But if we do show empathy, intellectual interest, and pedagogies of care, then the scene of teaching and learning will be reimagined all the time because it's collaboratively enabled and it's enlivened by the loving circulation of respect and expertise. And if we think about beyond schools and universities and colleges, we can think of this embracing of the present as not just caring about young people, but caring about all people. And when we think of it in a collaborative education context, it's about thinking, what can I do with Shakespeare and someone else to contribute somewhere else from where I'm based, thinking collaboratively, outwardly. And Shakespeare education has long been a field of innovative practice, and collaborative partnerships of all sorts of different types are occurring all around the world all the time. And Shakespeare's stories, which used to just be on the Globe Theatre stage, have gone into the world and are traversing the globe itself. And Shakespeare is reappearing in myriad guises, adapted, translated, appropriated, repurposed, and remediated. Now, the volume that I began my talk with pointing to floats the idea that maybe we could think about projecting Shakespeare as a thing. So not just performing Shakespeare, not just reading Shakespeare, but what might it mean to project Shakespeare? And the emphasis there, and this is what the book does, is on collaborative educational work, but in the context of a project. So when we reach out beyond our institutions and we link up with other people from other places and we create a new space. To project Shakespeare is an idea that blends outputs and processes. So a project is a partnership, it's a project, it's a network, it's a structure, it's a product, it's an arrangement. But a project is also an experience, it's a journey, a reflection, a realization, an act of giving, receiving, feeling and understanding, and transforming. And anyone who's been involved in project work where you create a new idea and you share it with someone else, and together it takes you somewhere that you don't fully know or understand until you get there, you understand the anxiety and the physiological thrill of embarking on projects that take you out of the institutions that you're normally working within. And so projects are a type of dreaming, and they're driven by project leaders who have one foot in the real world and one foot in this project world, just above the plane of the real, where they're seeking something new, something risky. And what they find in project work is the world. They're not inventing a new world. They're actually discovering the world that is there, but it's been hidden by institutional structures in many ways. And this is why we need collaborative projects to help us think outside structures that have become solidified. And the shape of Shakespeare changes as we do this sort of work, because we set up projects that are imaginative structures, and imaginative work goes on amongst them, and they are fragile projects. Sometimes they just crash and burn, other times they thrive, but they never quite fit on the old style inherited traditional structures that the various project partners may have come from. And that idea of projection is an idea of pushing outwards into something new. And the consequence is that we can unsettle old structures of education, we can loosen and heighten our understanding of disciplinary boundaries, of professional identity, of the teacher and learner dichotomy, of the analyst and maker division, of the scholar and public interface, and of notions of inclusion and the public good. And ultimately, what I'm arguing is that when we go out into collaborative project work and seize on some new idea, a new way of engaging with Shakespeare and the world, we're entering the edge of chaos. And what I mean by that is the edge of chaos is not chaos itself. It is an area where there is a degree of disequilibrium that helps enliven a system. But it's not utter chaos. It's not utter anarchy. What it is saying is that we're stepping out from an educational context, which at times is often over-systematized. And the project that I work with thinks of over-systematized education as cis-ed. And that's the term we use for it because we want to indicate that there's too much systematizing and we need a bit of room. We need a little bit of disequilibrium, a little bit of chaos to freshen up the way we're thinking, to allow in new ideas. And in collaborative project work, one thing that we think we can arrive at is the creation of new spaces in which to think and enjoy and teach and learn. And we've called those Arden space, after the Forest of Arden in Shakespeare's As You Like It. And Arden spaces are temporary spaces where co-learning can be experimental, fresh and risky, and it's between institutional structures, not locked within them. And the Shakespeare Reloaded project, and I'll just wrap up by saying a couple of words about it. The Shakespeare Reloaded project began as a Arden space. So we had the University of Sydney partnering with Barker College, which was a school, or still is a school, and the partnership together created the project. And that project has 5 different components in the green and the blue: an academic in residence program, postgraduate units of study, travel fellowships, conference, and also a website committee that ultimately produced our Shakespeare Reloaded website. But the point was that everyone could participate. Whoever was part of the project could participate in different elements of the project, and there was a flow of information between these different components. And in accordance with complexity theory, we allowed insights to emerge that were not predictable in advance. And that's where the freshness and the novelty could come from. And then it came back into the school and the university out of the project space itself. So the project was a type of Arden space where we could enjoy diverse and experimental thinking, and those ideas could come back into the systemic structures of the school and the university. And as a final example, if you go to the Shakespeare Reloaded webpage, you look at activities, you go to Shakespeare, you'll find a game where you can flip cards over related to a play, and those cards will take you to digital resources, which are 5-minute videos, or in this case, a 2-minute video that I'm showing there. And that's just a piece of video art, which is related to Macbeth, but not obviously. It's atmospheric. And this is an activity which is a kind of Arden space because you can present it in a classroom and the students can get a lot of pleasure out of exploring the short video and thinking what ideas it might prompt in response to Macbeth. So to conclude, Shakespeare is the ultimate complex adaptive system. He's out in the world, he's everywhere, he's interacting with the present in so many ways. And the pleasure of teaching and learning Shakespeare resides in us somehow embracing that complexity. And collaborative projects which establish their own refreshing Arden spaces are vital. They're a vital way to embrace complexity and experience the pleasure of teaching and learning Shakespeare. Thanks very much.